welcome again to the Schiller and Hamilton podcast. I'm here with Joel Hamilton today, and we're going to talk about proving damages in a personal injury claim. So, Joel, how are you doing today?
I'm good. It's my
Great.
first time being the interviewee.
Is it really?
On the show. I think so.
Okay. This is my second go as the interviewer.
Nice.
I interviewed Trent.
The tables have turned.
That's right. That's right. Well, we won't go too hard on you, but
okay, good.
hopefully this is some stuff that we deal with every single day. So, hopefully you'll be fine.
All right.
So,
what are we talking about?
So let's just talk about first. We're talking about personal injury claims here, obviously.
Okay.
How are injuries proven?
Oh, okay. We're getting right into it.
Yeah.
How are injuries proven? So, without evidence of an injury, the assumption is basically the injury didn't occur. So we always have to remember that the burden of proof is on us as the plaintiffs, as the ones bringing the case. So when we're representing the injured person, it's our burden to prove the extent of the injury. So what we need is evidence, right? And the most common form of evidence of an injury is the medical records. So the big takeaway is if you're hurt, you really need to go to a doctor. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people and they say, oh, my back has been hurting for weeks. Okay, well, did you go to the doctor? No, I wasn't sure if I could. You can. If you're hurt, you need to go see a doctor. That's the only way that anyone is ever going to be able to tell that you were, in fact, hurt. If there's not evidence of it, then it didn't happen. So the first thing is getting to the doctor. Anecdotally, there's also ways that we can kind of help corroborate or prove the extent of the injury, perhaps with video or pictures or even third-party testimony. Oftentimes, a spouse or a loved one that observes the way an injury has affected someone can be in a very effective person to give testimony about how that injury has actually affected that person. But the first thing is really the medical records. Always make sure, we need good imaging, for instance, if it's, a disc bulge or a broken bone or something that can be seen with imaging, whether that's an MRI or a CT scan or an X-ray, that requires going to see the right professionals, though. And that's really one way that we can help, because a lot of people don't understand what they don't understand what their rights are. They don't understand that they can go to the doctor. They don't understand that they don't need, and we talked about this in our last podcast. Yeah. You were discussing this. Folks don't understand that they don't need approval. It's not like a workers' comp claim where you might need approval. And a third-party liability claim, if you're hurt, you go see a doctor. If you need to go see a back doctor or you hurt your back, like go to an orthopedic, go to a neurologist, go see a chiropractor, whatever the case may be, funnel yourself into the right treatment that you think you need, listen to your body, and then it's our job to pick up the breadcrumbs, go get all those medical records that prove the injury, and that's our evidence.
Okay. So basically kind of treating it like any other injury that you may sustain. So if you were working at your house and you fell and injured yourself or something, just treating it like I'm injured, I'm going to go to the doctor.
So I don't mean to interrupt, but the problem that we run into is when the reality doesn't match what the records say. So someone may get through physical therapy, for instance, and they're released, not because they're better, but because the physical therapist says, well, there's nothing else I can do for you. And then the claimant thinks, okay, that's it. There's nothing anyone else can do. I'm done. And then you find out, weeks or a month or two later that they're still in a lot of pain and they still can't work. But now there's a gap in medical treatment where they didn't go to the doctor because they thought, well, there's nothing else anyone else can do for me. Now, all of a sudden, we have a reality that someone's remains injured, but the evidence that we have is that the medical records ended. And when the medical records end, the assumption is that that person got better. So it's important to follow up even if there's lingering pain and you don't think that there's anything anyone can do for you, there still has to be evidence of the record or on the record so that we can prove the injury. So it's important to go back to the doctor just to discuss that if you need to.
Okay. So like in a hypothetical, let's say someone is in an accident and an auto accident and is taken to the emergency room and I'm not going to say there's nothing wrong with them, but there's nothing that needs immediate help, such as surgery and things like that. And they're discharged and told to follow up with their primary care physician if they continue to have pain. So should someone do that? I know a lot of clients are worried about unnecessarily going to the doctor, and we don't want anybody to unnecessarily go to the doctor. But, what should someone do in that kind of situation if they're not having physical therapy, or they're not having, surgery or anything like that, should they follow up with their primary care physician, or should they try to seek out, a specialist, or what should they do?
Well, first thing, I always tell people to listen to their body, and your body will tell you what's wrong, and you know the difference between, soreness and being injured. At least most people do. And if you do have a primary care physician, it's a good idea to start there and let them be the quarterback. So that's there's pros and cons to that, right? The pro is, especially in a system that has like an Atrium or a Novant, for instance, we see a lot locally, it's very convenient for a general care physician to send someone to a specialist because they're all under the same roof. They're all in the same network.
Yeah.
They all take the same insurance. It's a little bit more difficult when you don't have that. But it's important that general care physician be involved and be able to quarterback it. The con is, what I just don't like to see is when someone starts with a general care physician and the default is, here, take a bunch of pain medication, come back in 2 months. I'll give you a month and then another refill. Come back in 2 months, and if you're still in pain, then we'll figure out something to do. And rightly, that person might listen to their doctor. And then all of a sudden, 60 days later, the pain medication runs out, and they're like, oh, I'm still in a lot of pain. This pain medication was masking it, but I haven't gotten better. But now there's a 2-month gap in treatment. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the reality is liability carriers just love to try to take advantage of a gap in treatment and use it as a means to try to devalue the case, even if there's a perfectly logical explanation for it, like there is in that hypothetical.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the evidence is found in the medical record. So when you go to a doctor has notes in the record that generally obviously vary depending on the doctor, from very detailed to not detailed at all. What can you do, what can we do when the record doesn't necessarily match the injury or it doesn't relay the injury well enough? What's some things we can do?
Well, and we see that oftentimes when someone's at the emergency room. Emergency room physicians or attendees can get a little busy. Emergency rooms are hectic. And oftentimes there's a little bit of discrepancy or factual errors within emergency room records, and that's not uncommon. For instance, I've seen some where, there's CT scans of the head, but then no mention of the head injury. Well, obviously, somebody talked about a head injury, or else no doctor would have ordered a CT scan of the head if there was no mention of the head injury. So that can be an error that can be something to deal with, but hopefully the overwhelming cumulative impact of the other records are enough to overwhelm a slight clerical error in another record.
Okay.
So that's one example, but treatment consistency is really the only way to overcome that. And very clear communication with your doctors when you go to the doctor is a way to overcome that on the front end. So the tendency might be to, okay, well, I'm going to see my general physician. He's not a back doctor, so I may not talk about my back. I'm going to go see my orthopedic doctor who takes care of my back, and I'm going to see a neurologist for some other nerve pain in my leg, so I'm not going to talk about that with that doctor. Well, then you have one record that shows this, one record that shows that. There's inconsistency there. Again, that's something liability carriers like to take advantage of. It can be very helpful to just talk about everything you have going on with every doctor. And that way, even if there's a slight error in the record, the overwhelming evidence of the rest of the records are normally enough to show that, hey, listen, there was a clerical error in this record, but the rest of the records are very consistent. We know what's going on. This is the injury.
Okay. While we're talking about injuries, let's talk about some lasting effects that may come from those injuries. We'll kind of divide this into two questions. First of all, is what if someone has a lasting impairment or a lasting disability? And I know we might get into economic harm and stuff like that later on, but as far as something that someone's just going to have to live with for the rest of their life, what do we do there in order to prove that? Because obviously it's something that hasn't happened yet.
Yeah. So nearly every significant injury carries with it some degree of residual permanency. So even if it's a clean fracture of your arm, for instance, I broke a leg in high school. A day like today, it's raining outside. Like I'm a little stiff when I get up in my left leg. And that was considered an injury that healed properly and correctly. So every injury is going to have a little bit of permanency. Does that give rise to an actual impairment? Well, that's up to the doctors. Mm-hmm. So when an injury, when someone reached maximum medical improvement, they've gotten better as they're going to get. They did physical therapy. They allowed time for their body to heal. They did everything right. Perhaps they had the surgery that the doctor required. This is it. They're not going to get any better. If they heal somewhere less than 100%, then the doctors need to assign some sort of impairment rating. And there's medical guidelines for that. It's a science. It's not
certainly.
It's not just throwing numbers at the wall. So what happens is they'll say, well, this person is impaired, 18% to the leg, and that might give them a 10% whole body impairment. So now we have a percentage. Now we have a number. Mm-hmm. And we know that this injury has affected them to that degree and will affect them permanently, meaning the rest of their life. So then the question becomes, okay, how long is the rest of their life? There's a big difference between a 30-year-old, a 20-year-old, or a 70-year-old. Thankfully, there's statutory guidelines that allow us to sort of project out the timeline for somebody, and it doesn't have to be subjective to that person. It's just if the person was born on this date, if they're this old, then they have X number of years remaining. And that's all by statute. So we can go to the code, we know how old someone is, and we can say, okay, well, if they're 50 years old, then they might have, 17 years or 20 years, whatever the number is, worth of life remaining. And we can project out that pain, the impact on their life over the course of the next 20 years or whatever the number comes out to be.
Yeah. And I'm assuming, or for our viewers and listeners, a lot of times this is where an expert may come in.
Yeah.
Someone who can forecast, future medicals that they may have to have, future medical treatment, can forecast the actual impact, whether that be economic impact or, loss of enjoyment of life impact, just the effect on their daily life. That's when an expert can come in, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. What about like disfigurement, scarring, things like that? Are those compensable as well?
I mean, they are. And that's where it gets a little bit subjective because we like to show the way that it's affecting somebody. And there's also a cost to it. So one way to get a cost on it is to get at least an estimate for a scar revision surgery.
Okay.
And sometimes folks will go get that scar revision surgery. And even after the surgery, there may still be residual scarring left. We see that a lot in dog bite cases. Dog bites are nasty scars. And when you go to emergency room with a dog bite, they don't like to do a clean suture and close the wound because it might become infected.
Yeah.
So they allow it to remain open so that it can drain properly. Well, an open wound heals differently than a wound that has a clean suture. So the effect of a dog bite is typically a nasty scar. But then after that heals, you might go to a plastic surgeon for a scar revision, and they can kind of cut it out and make it a much cleaner scar. So getting at least an estimate for the cost of that surgery can be very helpful. But, if someone earns their living on camera, for instance, and they have scarring on their face, it may impact their ability to earn a living, and then we have economic harm.
Okay.
Other than that, it can be emotional trauma for having to look at the scar and deal with it every day for the impact of the scar on your life. Especially with younger claimants, we've had, children and minors that have had to undergo counseling because they were very concerned about how the scar might affect them down the road. And of course, there's a cost associated with that as well, so that we can get those records and bills in, and that becomes an economic harm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, while we're talking, or we've transitioned here into economic harm, let's talk about that a little bit. What types of economic harm can be compensable damages in a personal injury case?
Sure. So broad strokes, the most obvious one is your lost income, although that can be tricky in certain situations, which we'll get into. Also, the cost of your medical treatment, and that's not just in South Carolina anyway, that's not just your out-of-pocket costs. That's the original charge. That's the cost of the treatment, the retail cost. There's also like incidental charges that people might not think of, mileage to and from the doctor or the physical therapist, and those can really add up, especially for someone in Rock Hill that has to go to a doctor in Charlotte, for instance, on a regular basis. That's a cost that can really start to accumulate. But really, what we mostly see are the lost income and the medical charges. Other things that might come into play, if someone pays out of pocket for a vacation and then they're in the emergency room and they can't leave for the vacation and they have a $10,000 credit card bill for a vacation that they didn't get to take. Or, a lot of times we see it when people have an injury and they're like, oh, well, I'm supposed to go to my nephew's wedding and I already booked the plane tickets and now I can't go because I have to undergo this surgery, or, I have an external fixation on my leg. I can't get on the airplane. Those become compensable. But the lost income can be a challenge. The easiest thing is if someone is a W-2 employee and they're missing X number of days or X number of weeks. Their employer cooperates and says, yeah, we normally pay them $20 an hour. They missed 40 hours a week for 3 weeks. That's easy math. Where it becomes challenging is when someone's either a 1099 contractor or if they own their own business, especially if that person gets paid under the table or they get paid cash. Well, how do you prove lost income when you weren't reporting income? Maybe you avoid taxation on the front end, but when it comes time to proving your income, there's nothing to prove. There's no paper trail. There's no evidence of it. When someone owns their own business, oftentimes we have to resort to tax returns to prove how much they typically make over that time. A lot of businesses that people might own are seasonal and have peaks and valleys associated with certain times of the year. Retail, for instance, we know is very high revenue in November and December, but might slow down substantially the rest of the year. Mm-hmm. If you're in the landscaping business, right now, springtime might be your peak season. And if you're injured in the springtime, well, then you miss out on all those contracts that are going to feed you for the rest of the year. Proving that can be tricky. So that comes down to lost opportunity. So if there are contracts that couldn't be met, that's helpful. If deals are done on a handshake, that can be more tricky. Now you have to get that other person involved and get them to testify that, yes, we had an agreement. You might need to get an affidavit from that person. And it just becomes more work. And if that person's not cooperative or doesn't want to be involved, and frankly, who could blame them? That might be an example of income that's very difficult to prove. And again, the burden of proof is on us. If we can't prove it, then it's not there. Mm-hmm. That lost income isn't there. So
to unpack that a little bit, let's go back to normal lost income or lost wages that someone may have suffered due to having to go to the doctor or, being signed out of work by a doctor. So my question would be, is a doctor's note critical in that kind of calculation?
Yes. If the doctor is not saying, or if the doctor doesn't agree that someone should be out of work, then it can be much harder to get that person compensated for the lost income. So if you are having to miss work, it's critical that there is a doctor involved who has written you out of work. Because if that doctor is not writing you out of work, the question arises, why are you missing work? It looks like you're choosing to be out of work or choosing to sit home from work. So if you're capable of working and the doctor's not writing you out, it's important to work. If you're not capable of working, you need to get a doctor to write you out so that we can prove the lost income.
Well, that seems very basic and very plain, but sometimes the doctors forget to include a work note.
Yeah.
So I would just, say for our listeners and clients is that if you feel you're going to miss work or the doctor kind of intimates that you need to stay out of work, you need to make sure that they give you a note, and to keep up with that note, keep following up with your doctor. And as you're going back for further treatment, to let them know how you're progressing and that if you continue to need to stay out of work, that you need to get that into a note.
And that's really where we see it, because everyone, you may start with the best intentions. The doctor says, let's you're having a lot of neck pain. We don't know what's going on. We need to get some imaging. I want to make sure you stay out of work for the next 2 weeks while we get the imaging to make sure that if you have a bulged or herniated disc, you're not making it worse while you're working. So imaging comes along. Yeah, there's a herniated disc, but now everyone's worried about, we're going to go into surgery. We're going to have to deal with physical therapy. You might not be thinking about that work excuse at that point. So even though you need surgery, your work excuse was only for 2 weeks and no one ever renewed it.
Exactly.
So it's important to keep up with it.
Exactly. That's good. To unpack a little bit about someone with their own business, let's say. Mm-hmm. I know I've had cases like this, and I'm sure you have too. Obviously, the more detail that person keeps, the more records of their business they keep, the better. I think we've both had cases, like you said, with lawn care personnel. And if you own a business like that, keeping good records of a logbook of who your, normal day, monthly clients are, trying to keep like a schedule and things like that, I'm sure could be helpful. What are any other things that someone may be able to keep or produce proactively in their business that in case they are in an injury, because no one ever knows when they're going to be in a car accident.
Right.
So what's some things that people may be able to do to kind of prepare if they, are in a car accident and they can't work, especially, like I said, if they own their own business?
Yeah, no one plans to get into a car accident. No one plans to be injured. And then recreating one's business records over the course of a year or more after the fact can be nearly impossible. The only thing to do is really just to keep good books on the front end and do everything properly. Okay. File your tax returns. Mm-hmm. Have an accountant involved, not necessarily a tax preparer, but an accountant. Use programs and the technology available that are super simple, like QuickBooks, or there's several other accounting apps that you can even use on your phone that are very simple. Avoid cash transaction without documentation. If there is cash, make sure you're writing and keeping receipts. And if you're doing things just with good business practices, then it shouldn't be a problem. There's different ways to compile records. There's the old analog way, which is a receipt book and a checkbook with the carbon copies and your bank statements and matching everything up. And there's a much more convenient way, at least when you're dealing with the forensic accounting that might go along with trying to recreate someone's income when you're in that situation. And it's much easier when those transactions are digital.
So just papering your business a little bit more.
Yeah. And I mentioned sometimes we do need to bring in a forensic accountant to be an expert to go through and put someone's books together and testify as to what someone's income might have been over the course of several years, and especially when you have a permanent injury, because now you have to talk about what their income was so that you could extrapolate what it would be, and that's where your economic experts come in.
That actually transitions is what I was going to ask you next, is what if something is a more permanent economic harm, whether that be an injury that precludes you from doing what you used to do before, or some other permanent injuries or whatever. So let's talk about that. Yeah,
you need some things to align. You need the doctors to align. You need the experts to align. So if the doctors and an occupational expert all agree that this is the extent of the injury, the occupational expert talks about how an injury to that extent will impact your ability to do your job and what your occupational alternatives might be or might not be, then an economist can say, okay, well, this person has this type of injury. They're not able to put their body into this situation to work. So they're going to miss out on this much income over the rest of their lives. So those cases involve hiring the right experts, making sure that the doctors are in line. And again, that starts at the very beginning with clear communication from the patient to the doctor. And then when all those pieces come together, we have evidence to be able to show, okay, this person has a permanent injury. They're no longer able to do their job. They have 20 years worth of good work life remaining otherwise. And then we have an expert to show this would have been their income. This is what they're missing out on. And there's a huge difference between what we call a closed period of disability and an open period of disability. A closed period of disability is if, you're injured, you're having to miss work for a month, and then you're better, and then you go back to work. That period of disability is closed for a month. But if it's just indefinite, it's open, it's permanent for the remainder of one's life, there's a big difference between a month's worth of disability and 20 years.
Certainly.
And so, when we have clients come in on the front end and, people love to ask, what do you think about this case? What do you think I might be owed? What are my damages? And a lot of times in that initial consultation, our response is we have no idea. I mean, it could be you could be better in a month. You might not ever be better. And until we know that, there's no way for us to draw a circle around the damages. So it's important that, the attorney and the client are kind of communicating through that process so that we know if we're presenting a case with that closed disability or, hey, we might have permanency here. This person got through the treatment. They're not better. We need to start putting together the evidence that we need to present that case. That's a lot different from a closed period case.
And whenever you're dealing with something permanent like that, there's so many variables. What an injury may affect, someone in our position a lot differently. I mean, we could lose the loss of our legs and still, practice law.
Yeah.
But someone may have a moderate knee injury, but that preclude them from doing their job. And given someone's work history and all of that kind of comes into fact there. So there's definitely a lot of moving parts with those kind of cases, and that's why it's good to bring in experts. I'm glad you discussed that. So we've talked about injuries. We've talked about economic harm. The third damage here really in most personal injury cases is the spectral pain and suffering or loss of enjoyment of life. So why don't you briefly kind of talk about in general what that is, and then we'll kind of talk about proving those.
So they are sort of more subjective than objective. Economic harm is very easy because you can oftentimes attach a dollar amount to it. That exercise becomes a little bit more difficult when you're talking about loss of enjoyment of life or suffering. But sometimes we can use examples in the market to help us peg a dollar value to something. For instance, if someone once really enjoyed jet skiing and due to a lower back injury, they're no longer able to jet ski, but that was something they did every weekend with their family, then they had to sell their jet skis. We know what the value of jet skiing is in the market because we have jet ski rentals. So we know that the market demands, $60 or $70 or $80 a day, whatever the case might be, for a jet ski rental. And again, if that's permanent, then we know that someone typically jet skis 30 weekends out of the year times 20 more years times $80 a day. That just gave us a value for his loss of enjoyment of life. If someone typically golfs, again, we know what the market value of that is. So we look for examples like that to try to peg a market value to an activity or a hobby. And the same thing can be said of other ways that an injury might impact somebody. Some people like to garden. Some people like to, just keep up with their house, their household chores, or even if they don't like doing it, they have to.
Exactly. They have to do it.
And again, we know what the value of that is because there are cleaning services. So we can say, well, they're not able to do this. Now they have to hire outside cleaning services. That's, $40 a day for a cleaning times however many weeks, times however many years. So we try to come up with math. The suffering can be difficult, especially when you have multiple injuries. It's important that, we try to frame the conversation and argument with regards to each specific injury. Because when you have more than one, if the tendency is to kind of clump the suffering together, it can devalue it. But if we can say, well, we know what a jury has paid or rewarded people for a neck injury, then we have that number. And then we know what a jury has awarded someone for, a humeral head fracture, for instance, then we have that separate. Now, we'd like to talk about those things separately so we can talk to the insurance adjusters and say, well, this is what this case is worth because they have this injury, but they also have this injury. So if we can keep those separate, that gives us a little bit more leverage. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to what would a jury award this person for this type of injury? And that can come down to the venue. I mean, as we know, certain venues, even within the same state, have drastically different average jury awards.
Wildly different.
Wildly different. So the value of one injury in one county might be drastically different from the value of that injury in another county. So thankfully we have tools. We can pull old jury awards, look at medical costs, look at, the type of injury, and see what juries have done with it. And sometimes for some injuries, when we can't really peg an economic value to it and we're just talking about, the degree of suffering for, a soft tissue neck injury is always the one. we're kind of stuck with what do juries do with it, and what's the likelihood? How is this case consistent with those cases? How is this case different from those cases? What's the likelihood that we exceed that average? What's the likelihood that we're below that average? So we're always talking about a probability curve because there's no set number when it comes to things like suffering.
Okay. So, outside of actually putting a dollar amount on some of this loss of enjoyment of life, what can a person or a client do to help build their case?
Yeah.
For, like, as we talked about, this kind of very spectral, very subjective, how something is affecting their life. How can someone help us prove that?
Well, again, it all comes down to evidence. So the better the evidence, the easier it is going to be to prove the case. And frankly, a lot of that is common sense. And think about what you're most likely to believe. Are you most likely to believe what someone tells you after the fact? Are you most likely to believe a picture or a video? Or are you most likely to believe, a consistent record? And really, that's your common sense is very consistent with how jurors would weigh evidence. So at the end of the day, that's what we're talking about. So over the course of treatment, it's important to talk about and journal how an injury is affecting you and your daily experience of the pain. So I like it when clients actually have a notebook where they say, man, I woke up on, March 5th and I had a headache that lasted 8 hours and I was stuck in my bed. I couldn't even turn the lights on. It was so bad. And then 2 days later, I got another one. Having that record, having that calendar that we can show to 12 people that don't know somebody that these are records that he was keeping in real time in his own handwriting or in her own handwriting that discuss the way that or the degree of this person's suffering. Being able to show that is way more powerful than someone just sitting there and saying, "Oh yeah, I had headaches."
Well, plus it's contemporaneous to the
injury.
It's
contemporaneous, exactly.
And then you mentioned photos and videos. Obviously, photos of if you have scarring, bruising, things like that, obviously show because someone relates. Oh, I remember when I had a bruise that bad; it hurt.
Right.
And I think we've talked about the other day in our other podcast that if someone's in physical therapy, videos of doing those exercises can kind of show that it's not just, okay, raise your leg.
Yeah.
It's not like
it's not massages
person.
And heat treatment and ice packs. It's especially if you have a rotator cuff repair.
Oh, yeah.
That physical therapy is just brutal. If you have an ACL repair or anything involving a joint that you have to work that hinge movement back into proper function, and if it's a complex joint like a shoulder or hip or even a knee, you're going to have a really hard time working that injury or working that limb back into proper form. And you're going to go through a lot of pain while you're working through your range of movement and while you're building that strength back. And as a matter of fact, there are some medical procedures where they actually put someone under general anesthesia in order to stretch someone's range of movement because it's so painful to do so otherwise. So video of that experience is very authentic and very powerful to explain because, again, what's more powerful, have someone just say, oh, yeah, I went through physical therapy and it was painful, or to have hours of video of someone having to sit there and work a knee or work a shoulder in a way that's obviously causing them a tremendous amount of pain, with the physical therapist encouraging them through those exercises. And it also shows that that person did everything they could to get back to health. Yeah. And at that point, the other side can't say, well, yeah, they were permanently hurt because they didn't treat. They didn't do what they needed to do. If you can show the own effort that you put in and the pain that you were willing to put your body through in order to get back to maximum health, but you're still not at maximum health, that's a pretty powerful message.
Certainly. And I think that it really helped. We talked about juries and even adjusters when we're dealing with the case pre-litigation. They have to put themselves into the shoes of the injured person. And even if you're sitting on the stand and you're testifying that, yes, I went through physical therapy, what kind of exercises did you do? Well, I had to, say if someone had an elbow surgery, well, I had to do elbow exercises to flex my elbow and move my arms up and down and left and right. Well, the healthy person sitting in the jury box may say, oh, I can do that.
Yeah, that ain't hard.
Nothing. Yeah. And so having a video showing someone in intense pain while they're doing that can just be leaps and bounds above. So Joel, I appreciate you answering those questions. If you wanted to wrap up real quick and kind of just put a bow on everything, what would you kind of tell to potential clients and anyone who may get in this situation in the future?
Yeah, I think the big takeaway is really open and consistent communication and record keeping. So going to the doctor, talking to the doctor, being open about your injury, being open with your attorney about your injury and how it's affecting you, communicating the effects maybe to a loved one or a spouse, and making sure that you're keeping good records, both of lost income business practices, journaling the impact on your life. And if you're doing those things, your case is more likely to result in you being properly compensated for your injuries.
All right. Well, Joel, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And everybody watching, thanks for watching, and I hope that you continue to watch our podcasts. And if you ever have any questions, please feel free to give us a call. Thanks.
Thank you.